The beginning of the story of the Allens, reaches back into the rural period of Birmingham. I love maps, and I happen to love this map. Anyone who's been around the museum probably has seen it many times too. But it's a map that shows the, you know what I didn't get is a pointer, but that's okay, I'll use my hands. It shows the village of Birmingham, and this is the original square that comprised the village of Birmingham. Although you see other areas with housing around the outside, the important point to keep in mind is that it was a small rural village for quite a long time, and suddenly things began to change. Here's a scene from probably about the 1880s, and this is Maple Road, or at the time it was called Mill Road. This is the mill, and Corton Lake is beyond that. We're standing in this view, we're standing basically on Southfield Road looking west. So this is the Rouge River down there. The ruralness, if that's a word, of Birmingham did not mean that it wasn't a busy place and that it didn't have a lot going on. And this is, in fact, one of the more fun photos we have that was taken of a busy day in Birmingham with all the buggies coming and going. And this is, best as we can determine, this is the intersection of Maple and Woodward, standing kind of on Maple looking west toward Woodward and beyond. I think that's where that is. So things began to shift in pretty much the 1890s, and it all happened because of transportation, or at least that was a big part of it. The technology shifted from buggies and horses to light rail. That meant that people could communicate, they could visit, and they could ship supplies, and they could go back and forth much more easily further away. So the Detroit United Railway, or the DUR, ran right up Woodward Avenue from Detroit to Pontiac and then on to Flint and even beyond. And so this is a photo of downtown Birmingham with the rail lines running right through the dirt road of Woodward Avenue. That change, at least in Birmingham and small communities along the rail lines, made a big difference in what happened economically in those small towns. One of the things that started to happen is that land value started to go up for the purposes of housing. And the pressure to sell farmland and turn it into housing for people who wanted to locate in this nice little town of Birmingham, but take the DUR back and forth to manufacturing centers in Pontiac or in Detroit. That became, it was sort of like an early form of what we would call a bedroom community now, a la 1890. So we're not talking about thousands of people, but we're definitely talking about people looking at Birmingham as a desirable place to live, even if they worked somewhere else. Here's another map that is a little easier to see. This is the annexation map that actually was prepared in 1970, but what it shows is the various farms that were turned into subdivisions and annexed between 1922 and 1928. So the original village squares here, and then all these areas with different colors. The colors just indicate different annexation groups, but you can see how quickly everything expanded in just a matter of about 6 years. Here's a great photo that shows Birmingham at Woodward and Maple around 1910, just as this shift is beginning to happen. Look at those trees. Another great map. This map is from a little bit later, but you can see the progression. Actually, I'll go back. So this is the growth. Well, let me point out a few things before I go back. So this is the Coryell Park subdivision. Here's Quarton Lake and all the Quarton Lake estates. Everything up and around Woodward is being expanded. Things coming east are being expanded. So compare that to, come on, back, to this. Yes.
What was the street that was at the bottom of the oldest? I can't see.
Go all the way back.
Yeah, that one right there.
Oops.
No. Yeah.
Here?
Yeah.
What's this boundary line here? Let's see. Believe that would be 14 Mile Road, yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense.
The square represents Lincoln to the south.
The square here?
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Lincoln.
So growing pains is, I guess, one way of characterizing what it was like in the community from the city leadership or the village leadership point of view. There were all of these new residents, which is very exciting, the economic growth, which is, everyone wants that, especially even then, I guess I would say. But the demands on the water and the streets, the improvements that were required to meet the needs of all these people coming and going. And even though some of the outer subdivisions were not annexed until the late 20s, those people were tapping into and using the water system and so forth. And it really began to put pressure on the small village about keeping up with all of that. For example, one of the problems was that there was no such thing as planning and zoning really until the latter part of the 20s. So some of those new subdivisions tried to keep property values stable by deed restrictions. And at the time, the deed restrictions would often be on the basis of race or religion. There were I couldn't find any in Birmingham, but the rumor is that some individual properties had deed restrictions against Jewish people owning the property. But we know for sure people of color, there were restrictions on that. And then on the other end of it, the deed restrictions were often requiring people to build a house of a certain value. Had to be, at least $6,000 or whatever the value at the time, which meant that all of the houses in one area would retain a similar value. And partly that was to protect land values because there was no other way to do it. Another important thing to the city leadership, village leadership, was that there was all this growth going on up and down the Woodward corridor, Pontiac, Detroit, all of the towns in between, Royal Oak. Things were booming, things were expanding, and manufacturing was coming in, and huge influxes of population from other parts of the country coming up to Detroit and locating where they could work in this new auto industry, which was a brand new thing and huge employer. And as all this growth was going on, there was a concern in the village of Birmingham by some of the leadership that the village was going to get basically swallowed up in all of that. And it was going to stop being the entity that it was, that everybody was very proud of. They also wanted to maintain control. They wanted to be able to direct their own future. They didn't want the paving of Woodward to come right through downtown and completely obliterate their town. So there were reasons that there were pressures on improving things and bringing in new infrastructure, but not doing it without retaining control. The paving of Woodward Avenue is an example of the kind of pressure that occurred. I think my next one is no, it's not a photo. Woodward Avenue was dirt, like I showed you in one of the previous photos, from Detroit to Pontiac until 1916. And then it was paved. It became the first paved concrete road in the US. And it went from Detroit all the way to Pontiac. And that was because the auto industry, which was brand new, we're talking about 1916, people were using automobiles and they needed a good surface to drive on because the dirt roads didn't work for that. So it was really as a response to that change in transportation, but it was only paved to be 16 feet wide. It was a 16-foot wide ribbon from 6 Mile Road all the way to Pontiac. And at the time, it was celebrated as, this is going to be good for 25 years. I mean, that's how advanced they thought they were being. But it got completely out of control. The growth was crazy. And so within about 5 years, in 1921, it was grossly inadequate. People were stalled, sitting in their Model A's and Model T's on Woodward Avenue all the way trying to get out of Detroit to Pontiac in what were the first traffic jams, and it was not working. So the concept of wider Woodward was being discussed at that time. What we have now with the wide boulevard and the two, the north and south lanes and the middle median, that concept was first discussed in regards to Woodward in 1921. But it was the kind of engineering and community and funding nightmare that was going to take many years to build. But you can imagine being in Birmingham's downtown and looking on this already, the paved part of Woodward that went through Birmingham had already disrupted town. So now they're talking about widening it. How's this all going to work? So it became a huge concern in Birmingham. So enter W.D. Clisby. Warren Dwayne Clisby was called W.D., and he was a big guy, and he had a cigar in his mouth a lot of the time, and he was used to making his point in loud and firm ways, and he was really devoted to progress. He was an interesting guy in a lot of ways. He actually came to Birmingham from another part of Michigan, from Quincy, to be the Hill School, the only school at the time in Birmingham, the Hill School superintendent. At the time, the Hill School was the only school. All children of all ages went there. It was like a tremendously large one-room schoolhouse. And he instituted a lot of educational ideas to keep good records and identify curriculum goals and standards. And so you can see the kind of guy he already was, even as a young man. He and his family, at first, when they came to town, rented a small house somewhere, I think, on Willett Street. Now, I'm guessing because I don't remember the detail, but it was right around the corner so he could walk to Hill School, because Hill School was at Maple and Chester. So every day he would walk past the little schoolhouse that had preceded the Hill School that wasn't used anymore as a schoolhouse. It was right where the Allen House is located now at Southfield and Maple. Little red schoolhouse, nice little Gothic. I'm going to show you a picture in a little while. But he would walk past this, and it was a residence at that time because someone had bought it and turned it into a home. And he'd walk past it, and he loved that house. And he wanted it, but he couldn't get the owner to sell it to him. So he went by it all the time. And then in 1914, to 1915, he ran for village council, or I think they called them trustees at the time, and he was elected village president in 1914 and 15. So that's around the time that some of these changes are coming to be. He was, actually, let me restate that. He ran to fill a vacant position that only had one more year, is what it was, in 1914 and 15. So he completed that term, and in that time, he and the rest of the trustees worked very hard to do something about the streets and the water, especially. The water situation in Birmingham at the time was awful. Surface water, which often was polluted from privies and other sources of runoff, would run down into the Rouge River and run down into Corton Lake. And it basically polluted almost all the surface water. And then people were using wells for their water source. And it was, even as far back as Martha Baldwin in the 1890s, there was a lot of worry about the hygiene of the water, but also if the wells being used in town could really pull enough water if there was a serious fire. Could it really put out the kind of fires that would really devastate the entire town? So there were all kinds of things about water, how to get it where it needed to go, but nobody wanted to pay for the infrastructure. Things just don't change very, very much, do they? So very little really happened. They did some minor improvements during that time. But basically, at the end of his term, he left and he didn't run again until 1920. Things had not changed enough in his mind, so he ran again, and actually he was elected. And he was elected on the promise that he was going to deal with the water and improve the water for the village. So there was a little controversy that occurred because his plan, and he was village president, his plan was to build a new water storage tank. And he wanted that water storage tank to be located somewhere besides where all the waterworks had been, which was down in the Rouge Valley, right at Baldwin and Maple area, which is Baldwin Park right now. It was low in there, and that's where all this polluted water was constantly running. And he said, it should not be there. That's the wrong place to put our water tower. So in essence, he ran on that and was elected. But when people started realizing what was involved with the cost of creating a water tower and the well system for it, they sort of backed off. And there was an attempt to maybe issue a bond for it, but it was going to go down. It was going to fail. And so what he did, and he's remembered by some people still today, he went ahead and signed a contract on behalf of the village to have a 300,000-gallon water tank constructed without voter approval, and subjected the village, therefore, to the commitment to build it. And they had to go out to do a bond issue in 1924 to get the money for it. So things were a little rough on the Clisby family from people who were very opposed to how he went about doing that. He was old style, like I said, cigar smoking, get it done kind of guy, and voters didn't have to agree with them. That tower is the one that was built on the other side of Woodward, where the water tower is now.
Is there still water in that tank?
I believe so. This is the waterworks that was obsolete. Okay, so around the same time, Harry Allen enters the picture. He was born in 1882 in a farm out on Maple Road. It was his family was his dad was a farmer, but not, a highly educated person. And he really didn't want to continue in the farming mode. He actually was very bookish as a child. This is something that was characteristic of him his whole life. He loved books. He loved the library. When Martha Baldwin began the Ladies Library Association in town, he would go to the library and spend a lot of his time there. I'm imagining they knew each other at some point, but in any case, he had attended Hill School and met Marion Clisby, who was WD's only daughter, I think, there at the school, and they befriended each other, and they knew each other then. But he continued on with education because his mother saved her egg money to send him to the U of M, which had a law preparation program at the time. He zoomed through it with high marks. He came out interested in a new field called municipal law. Didn't exist before then. And he went to work right after he graduated from U of M at Race and Haas in Detroit in 1917. Or in 1909 he went to work for them, and by 1917 he was a full partner. So he was a smart guy who knew the law. Let's just put it that way. But the other thing is that he loved Birmingham. His father and mother still lived out on Maple Road. I believe their farm, and Molly, maybe you can adjust my expectation if I'm wrong, but I think their farm became part of the country club out there. Oakland Hills? Yeah. So that's where it was generally located.
Can we ask questions, or should we save it for later?
It would be okay to ask a question.
What's the egg mine? Did they have a chicken farm, or what the egg mining come from?
I think it was all kinds of farming, but she sold eggs as part of what they raised there, and so she put her egg money aside. That's according to an oral history we have.
It takes a lot for you.
It took a lot, I'm sure it did. So here's Marion Clisby in her wedding portrait. She was, at one point she took a job in Detroit, and so she would ride the DUR, the light rail down Woodward every day to her work down there. And Harry, who was going to the law firm every day, would also ride the DUR. And so they, had this courtship on the DUR by sitting together every day and chatting. And after he became village attorney in 1914, the village of Birmingham hired him as an attorney. They became married. They were married actually at the Clisby house, which, because Clisby couldn't get his hands on the red schoolhouse yet, wasn't available to him. They had built a house on Southfield Road. And it's cool, we have the wedding, the list of the people who attended a wedding, which is about 20 people. And the bigwigs for the village, at least the ones that liked W.D. Clisby, did come to the ceremony. And so they were married in 1914, but they actually moved down to Detroit for a little while. They lived in Highland Park for a little while. Marion is a key figure in, not so much in the political life of Birmingham, but definitely in the family life and the way things turned out later. She's described as being really strong, determined, but also very practical, and at the same time proper. So I guess she sounds like everybody's nightmare for a mother, You'd have to keep your clothes clean, but you couldn't play outside and get them dirty, and you had to be proper. But honestly, she was a real strength in the family. And the other interesting thing about her is that she was preservation-minded, even as a younger woman. And I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. This is an image of the Hill School around the time that Harry and Marion may have attended. So you can see that all the children out there are of different ages. And the Hill School was built at the time to accommodate all of the children in the Birmingham area, which included people from the surrounding farms. Okay, so I was talking about Woodward Avenue and then the need to pave it and expand it into the wide superhighway. That's what they called it at the time, and it really kind of characterizes it now too. This shows some of the traffic. This is heading north of Birmingham out into the Bloomfield area. And you can see there's new construction going on, and you can also still see farmland that was very quickly converted to subdivisions. Another great photo of downtown Birmingham at around this same time. So you can get a feel of what the environment is like there. It's already changing. Even during Harry and Marion's lifetime, it was, a very dramatic change from dirt to pavement, from horses to automobiles. Parking was a problem then, if you can tell. So in this environment, a couple of interesting things happen. Again, Harry is the village attorney, so he's advising and counseling the village council. And after 1914, one of the things they decide to do is they adopt the manager commission governing structure in 1917. That's a big deal for a couple of reasons. It was a new idea. It was based on the idea of corporations and CEOs. So a corporation has a board of directors with a CEO that operates the company. And the manager commission structure in government was very similar. But it was a new idea. And again, this is where I think Birmingham as a municipality was trying to get ahead of the progress that was happening all around it. A lot of the changes that Birmingham adopted were not adopted by other towns for many decades afterwards. So I talked about they were concerned about retaining the individuality of the community in the face of all the development going on. They wanted more control. And as part of the township, which they were when they were a village, they did not have control over everything. And they had to pay to the township for services. So that was another problem that they were itching to get out from under that problem. During this time, they started developing, and again, this is Harry, I think, in the background, advising them and guiding them, but also WD and some of the other progressive people. They wanted to make Birmingham's civic services like the centerpiece of the village. And so they needed to acquire land, and they needed to fund a new municipal center for the police, fire, and the village administration, and they also wanted to build a new library. Those are the buildings we have now downtown. So the municipal building was being discussed and eventually funded at the same time. And originally it housed the police and the fire in the same building. Afterward, it wasn't possible for fire to continue in the building, so they've moved out. And the fire department, the police department sometimes wishes it could because, they're crunched for space. But it's interesting that we still have that building as the center of the village, the municipal government structure. And the library. Can you imagine? I can't. Can you imagine Birmingham without that library in its downtown? But at the time, neither one of these buildings was there. It was houses. The Shanes had a house where Shane Park is. residential streets, and there were some small buildings that were used for the council to meet in. That was pretty much it. So a little bit more, how are you going to pay for those improvements? Bond issues. But it was the roaring 20s. Money was pouring out of the corners of everybody's pockets, and banks were locating in Birmingham, and new banks were going up all the time. And so what started to happen is this sort of rolling set of bond issues, and there were some smaller ones to pay for some electric and street improvements and some water main work. And then the water towers bond issue was 1924. And then in 1926, the Civic Center and Municipal Building with the library, that went out. That was like the last big one in 1926. And so that's when the money was raised to build it, and the buildings were designed that we see today. Voters, though, my last point on that page, voters, though, this thing about becoming a city, that's a lot of change. Maybe we don't need to do that. I love this picture because for a couple of reasons. One is that those people are all seated in such a way, it looks like they all just were the cats that swallowed the canary. I don't know why. This is the outgoing council. In 1928, the calendar says it's April. So they have another 6 months in office. To my knowledge, they all were replaced when the election took place in November. One of the interesting people is this woman right here, Hope Ferguson Halgren Lewis. She was the first woman commissioner. So talk about progressive. It had only been a few years since women got the vote, and here she is on the village council. It's pretty cool, I agree. Plus we have a picture of her, and I love the glasses, so I had to show you that. Again, as the city, I keep saying city because that's what we are now, but as the village was trying to position itself towards potential cityhood. So it had gone out to the voters. Voters said no thanks, but it was like they weren't going to give up on it then. They continued to have issues with costs rising because of the township services. They had to pay the township quite a bit of money, and they didn't like doing that. And then in the 1928 election in November, Harry Allen was elected to the commission. So he no longer is village attorney because now he's on the commission proper. But he's a successful attorney. He knows municipal law, and he begins to, with his fellow commissioners, begins to look at ways of taking this issue back to the public. Let's form a city. There are all these advantages. Let's do it. On the way there, one of the changes that they looked into was to look at zoning. How do we adopt zoning ordinances? Now there was, I think it was Herbert Hoover, who encouraged communities to consider zoning. It was like a new idea. Up to that time, it was kind of like higgledy-piggledy. You put your manufacturing next to a cow barn, which is next to a store, which is next to a school. There was no planning. So they began to look at this in a very conscientious way. And in fact, in 1929, they did something really amazing, I think, for a small village. And they brought in a nationally known planner. Planner was a brand new profession. It didn't exist until around that time. They brought in a guy who, and we have the first city master plan, which is hilarious compared to how the current master plan process goes. But it's a booklet with some suggestions and some sketches about how to deal with traffic and how to have trees on streets, all kinds of really nice things. But it's really very simple. It's only, 20 pages long or something like that. Anyway, but that was a huge leap forward. So that
was also one of the first master plans of any city in the entire country.
in the country, yes.
We were on the leading edge for the entire country
That's right. So just for the record, Commissioner DeWeese is reminding us all that that was one of the first master plans in the nation. Okay, so Harry continued to push his agenda, and of course he had his detractors. And in the 1930 commission election, they had to do a recount because he and another elected, I don't know the proper term, but another, pardon?
Contender.
Yeah, another contender, thank you, whose name was Ellerby, were so close. When they did the recount, Harry won by 3 votes in the village. So it was like 688 to 685 votes. So it was this huge deal. Now, I have to believe that that's got to do with concerns about becoming a city and people wanting to remain the way they were. But it was 1930, okay? People didn't know that they were going to have a 10-year depression ahead of them. In fact, after the stock market crash in 1929, the city was able to continue to make all its interest payments on all of the bond issues. It never defaulted on anything, and partly it was because the village council, the village became very, very careful about every penny and every bit of the expenditures. And a lot of that was Harry also helping devise ways of making things work. And so he helped navigate through some of those tricky spots. And in essence, the cost of remaining a village was so high that it was a little easier next time it went to the voters for them to vote to become, in fact, a city. And what they did was they approved that a 3-person commission would be formed. This was in 1933 when they voted it, to write a city charter. This was the depth of the Depression. In fact, bank holidays had been called nationally a couple of times already. It was a very scary time. But during a 2-month period, Harry and his 2 fellow commissioners, but he was leading the way, wrote our city charter. And within 2 months, had it ready to put before the public. The public approved it with a vote of 86% to become a city. And we became a city. And then Harry was then elected the first mayor of the city. So you can see how the stamp of his efforts shows through every one of these changes while Birmingham was trying to become a city. So just a bit more about him. So he was actually mayor. At the time, mayor was an elected office, directly elected. So he led the city through the financial crisis of the Depression. As I said, the city paid all its debts. That put the city in great position when the recovery did begin after the Depression. When he left office in 1936, there is a public tribute to him for his leadership in keeping the city on an even keel and strengthening it during the Depression. In 1937, he was no longer mayor, but he helped develop the first zoning ordinance in Birmingham. And then he served on the library board, his big love, his lifelong love, from 1944 to 1956. He died in 1957. So that's a little bit about Harry the man. And I had thrown in a little bit of what W.D. Clisby was like. But now I want to talk about the property because that's part of the story too, and it's part of the family legacy. So this is the Sanborn Map. Sanborn fire insurance maps were issued during the late 1800s and the early 1900s as a part of determining the proper way to insure buildings and homes. And so they have great detail on them. And this is Maple. This is Southfield. Here's Willits in the background. And then this area I've kind of shaded out pink. You have to ignore this for a second. shaded out pink is currently the museum site and a little bit part of the park near Baldwin. But it's basically the acreage that still surrounds the museum site. This is where the Little Red Schoolhouse was located. And by 1921, the previous owner that had turned it into a residence had put up a barn. So that's the barn that they had on the property. So this is interesting too, because this is an inset for further down Maple Road. This shows the waterworks, the obsolete waterworks, and where it was located, right opposite Baldwin there. This was how the Red Schoolhouse had been fitted out to be a residence. It was used as a schoolhouse from 1856 to 1861, I believe, is when the Hill School was built. And during that few-year period, it was used kind of like as a small elementary school primarily. When the Hill School was built, all the students went over there, so it was empty. So Horace Randall purchased the property, and he turned it into a home. And by the time of the 1890s, he had installed plumbing and a system for heat. And there was an addition put on the back. You can kind of see that addition in the back. But Clisby was still loving it, and I guess he offered to purchase it more than once. It wasn't for sale, but then Horace Randall apparently died, and Warren Clisby snapped it up. Part of the property, it was a lot of acreage, and it was all still in the village. That 1 mile square village still had this large parcel of property on it. This image here is like if you were down at the Rouge River. Currently, the museum is up the hill there, and Maple Road is up there, and you're down in the valley walking along. So there still is a trail, something like where this is located now. That's the barn that had been added to the parcel. Here's another view. This is actually the same general location. You can barely make out the barn up there, just so you know what it looked like at the time. Here's how the Red Schoolhouse looked from the back. And I like this picture too because it shows the housing that was across the street at the time. So apparently, and this is one of the tricky things that I was trying to work out in the historical record, apparently the Warren Clisby was still alive in 1925. The Red Schoolhouse had been occupied as a residence for a while. When W.D. Clisby was able to purchase it, he owned the property, and we understand that he and his wife moved into it, and he did some improvements inside the building for a period. But he was already quite advanced in age. And apparently he transferred the property to Marion and Harry in 1925. He was not deceased yet, but that was when they began to plan for building their country estate. Apparently the property became theirs even though W.D. was still alive, so it didn't depend on his death. And the intent was to blend some of the old house, the little red house, with something new. They brought in an architect named Rupert W Koch, or Koch, I don't know how he pronounced it, but he was a locally well-known architect. He designed the Greystone Ballroom in Detroit in 1922. And another one that he was known for, and it still exists, the Greystone is gone, but is the Leander J. Hoover Mansion in Ann Arbor. So he was a revivalist architect, and at the time that was common. There were a lot of there was a lot of money coming into the auto industry. A lot of people wanted revival type homes, large homes on large estate-like properties. And so he was one of those architects who was trained to put together a lot of different styles, but in a very classical way. Now, this is interesting. Part of my interest, part of my background is in architectural history. So this building, as a form of a colonial residence, is in 1917, is a very good example of what became more common later on, which is a little more restrained way of treating colonial style architecture. But the colonial, we have this photo to draw from because this project preceded the Allen House. And so that's an interesting part of his architectural history. So I don't know if I can explain it very well with these photos, but I'll do my best. So on the right is a photo of the Little Red Schoolhouse. You can see it has, a center door, 2 window openings in the front. It does have a little porch. And then along the side, it has 3 windows. And then it has a substantial foundation. This corner of the Allen House here is the same as this corner of the Little Red Schoolhouse there. And as you turn the corner, again, it's very difficult to see in this picture, but the remnant of the sill from the window is still here. In fact, they bricked it in when they built the Allen House. It was really important to Marion to save the red schoolhouse and to incorporate it into the final design. The other thing I think they did when I was trying to study it is I think the windows on either side of the door are also in the same locations. I think all they did was take out the old windows and fashion new windows. And when I walk up to these windows and look at them, they look like they have the old limestone sills, just like the schoolhouse did. And there's a limestone threshold that you have to walk in through the main door. The story is, and I've read it in a couple of different accounts, is that during the time that, the architect drew up plans, which I'm going to show you next, so you get a chance to look at these. So here were the plans he drew. The idea was keep the red schoolhouse block in the middle, and then add these successive wings. They get successively smaller with slightly different architectural detail, and then balance it on this side. In part, you had to do that because the site where the Little Red Schoolhouse is, where the Allen House is, if you've ever walked around those grounds, it's high there and then it drops precipitously. There's nowhere else you can really build a house. If they tried to build something in the lower area, it's too wet down there. So I think he kind of came up with this ingenious design, which is to make this sort of long house, but so that it doesn't look like a great big freight train on a long tube. He has these successively reduced additions, and yet they're very visually balanced. He did a lot of interesting things with this house, actually, to give it a lot of flair. And I won't have time to go into it tonight because we're already running out of time. But I welcome anybody to call me or stop in at the museum, and I'll be happy to share what I think about that. Here's a picture of the Allen House in the 1930s. Now, one of the features on this site was that there was a large pond in the back, and the Clisbys had at one time apparently kept trout in part of the pond. They had a little bit of a construction done on it, and somehow we're trying to raise trout or something. But what they did when the Allens moved in is they actually created a swimming pool, with 4 walls and a floor in the middle of the pond so the kids could swim in it. And you can see it in that upper right picture. You're looking down toward the pond, and then here's another view of it.
Was the house moved at all, or was it in the same position?
The house, the
What?
Allen house, you mean?
Yeah, the red schoolhouse. Was
Yeah, no, it didn't. Oh, it started to fall when they were doing construction, and they actually rebuilt the walls right where they were and continued with the, yeah, no, it wasn't moved. But you must have been anticipating what I was going to say, because this little building was removed, actually. If it looks like the Allen house, you're right, it's supposed to. It was the playhouse, and it was built right next to the Allen house, where the Hunter house is located now. This little playhouse was built to resemble the big house. It has everything. It's got the dormers, it's got the Chippendale, Chinese Chippendale rail style, it's got a porch, it's got pillars, and the whole thing. And in this picture, you can see the scale. I think that's Jim Allen sitting on the rail there. And I think there's a figure there that might be his sister, Peggy. But when the Hunter house was moved there, apparently this was the only spot left on the site that they could locate it, so this was apparently torn down. Okay, so I want to tell you about the last thing in the family that I think is a good takeaway about what they were like as people and what they had to deal with. This is a great photo. There's W.D. and his wife, Nellie. And those are, the children are James and Peggy Allen. And here are Peggy and James. Again, Peggy's name was Eleanor. She went by Peggy, and a friend of theirs. Between this picture and this picture, James Allen was stricken with polio. He was actually about, some accounts say 9, some accounts say 10, but it was 1927. And the story is this. The pool that was created for swimming, it was a really hot summer. They moved in March of 1927 into the house. It was a really hot summer. So it was that fall, that August or September, and the kids were all down playing in the water. And Jim got sick right away. And he had all the classic symptoms of polio. And he, in fact, was confirmed to have a case of polio, and they said he would never walk again. He was only 9 or 10 years old, and he had been a real athletic boy, loved to run and jump and all of that. And so at the time, the standard treatment for polio, and they didn't understand how it was transmitted. Could it have been picked up in the water? Well, the answer is yes, it could have, because it was a virus. It is a virus that is often found, in the water system. But most of us get exposed when we're infants and we develop immunities. Sometimes, especially during the age of the huge polio epidemics, there were children who were not exposed for one reason or other, usually because the conditions were so clean, actually, that they didn't get exposed when they were little. And so those are the children who would often be stricken the hardest. So this is where Marion Allen's character comes in, because she didn't buy this idea that he was supposed to just lay in bed and that he would just be paralyzed for the rest of his life. And she insisted that he work his legs and work his legs. And he had, he was in a lot of pain, and he was just a little boy, but he did what his mother made him do. And his leg grew to, almost adult size. So it was stimulated enough to do that. He was able to balance and do walking with assistance. So he actually did acquire the ability to ambulate, but he was stricken with a disease that made him, that was a painful one, and it was difficult for him all his life. Here's another nice photo of James and Peggy in the living room in the Allen house in 1933. One of the things that he adopted as his way of making it in the world was he knew that people were uncomfortable about his physical limitations. And so he would right away come up to people and shake their hand and say, "Hi, I'm Jim Allen." And he was actually really popular in his high school, and he was elected class president more than 1 year running. So he had the support and the acceptance of all of his peers, in part because he treated himself like he was just a guy who happened to have polio instead of that polio defined him. And I'm sure that Molly has heard other stories way beyond this, but that's just kind of the main point I wanted to make. He went to law school. He went to work at the same firm that his father was at, and he became a partner as well. He also ran for city commission in the city of Birmingham and was elected in the 1950s. But that isn't the only thing that he did for the city of Birmingham. He actually facilitated the transfer of the property that is now the site of the museum, that's owned by the city, on behalf of the public. And he worked with his mother to make all the arrangements and to transfer the property over. She, after Harry died, she continued to live there, and Jim started the process of working toward transferring the property in order to preserve it. She was all on that idea. She loved that idea that her home, the Allen house, would be preserved and that the land would be preserved as a historical park. And so they went out to the public and did a bond issue, another bond issue, and the public voted to approve for the city to purchase it and maintain it as a kind of a conservation park. That's how they termed it at the time. This is the 1960s and early 70s. And to move the Hunter House over there, because at the same time, the Hunter House was threatened with demolition, and everyone knew it was the oldest house in Birmingham and it should be saved. Well, now it had a place to go. And so this all made sense to everybody. And I thought you would want to see this picture of the Hunter House being moved. There it is. Another shot of the Allen House, a little bit more contemporary. And this is how they are associated to each other today. And that is the last slide I have. So, questions, comments for me, or more importantly, for Molly, who's agreed to answer questions?
I think you already all the information.
Well, let's see. Does anyone have any comments or questions? Yes?
Question, you lost me. Was Jim Harry's son or grandson?
Yes, Jim was Harry's son.
Son. But one photo showed.
Yes, he was with his grandparents in that photo. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
that
thought
would be
it was two
confusing.
generations somehow.
Oh, yeah, no.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? Yes. Go ahead.
I have two brothers and a sister that all live elsewhere, but they're all alive. But my parents are, my siblings are still around.
Okay, I'm sorry. I could repeat that for the recording. What was the question about?
If my brother, did you know my brother? No. Oh, I wondered, I have two brothers and a sister, and they all live elsewhere.
Okay.
They're all alive.
Okay, and you are the youngest
I'm number 3 of 4.
of Jim's children.
Yes.
Yes, so Jim is your father. You're number 3 of 4, and you have 2 brothers and a sister. And Martha Allen recently wrote, your sister Martha, recently wrote an article for, she writes for a publication called the Lake Placid News. And she wrote about Jim's polio and her father's polio, what she remembered about it, in part because I had tracked her down, I think through email, and said, can you tell me a little bit about this? We don't know what really happened there. And the process of answering some of my questions stimulated her to write an article about it, which was kind of nice too.
How much of polio suffering did he have to live with? He couldn't walk.
Well, my understanding from Martha, and Molly, I don't know if you can add to this because you were part of the family. He had a cane, or he had a way that it was difficult to walk, though. Am I correct?
Yes, one leg that was in a brace, stationary, that could be locked and unlocked if you need. The leg didn't really work.
Mm-hmm.
The other leg, he could put weight up, so he'd swing the non-working leg along. When he was
Right.
young, he could do very well with a cane.
Right.
But as he got older, it became more and more difficult.
Okay. Okay.
So he was 63. So there's post-polio syndrome that they stopped researching because it became unnecessary.
Yes. I've heard about it. We're talking about, for the record, we're talking about post-polio syndrome and how Jim Allen got around okay as a younger man with a brace on his bad leg. Was that his right side, or you don't know?
Yes.
His right leg, but it was difficult with a cane, but the older he got, the more difficult it got, and there is a condition called post-polio syndrome, which is also lung, isn't it? Sort of a... I know that there are some polio survivors today that their treatment consists of going into water. It's similar, it takes the pressure off some of the bones, and it helps with movement and so forth, and that's all I know about it.
What about Peggy? Did she have children?
She had 2 children and then died very young of breast cancer.
So Peggy Allen had 2 children and died young of breast cancer.
Are these people buried in Greenwood Cemetery?
Are these people buried in Greenwood Cemetery? What a great question. They are. WD is there. WD, his wife, Marion, Harry, and I hope that if you haven't been to the cemetery for a while, you'll consider going on the Greenwood Cemetery tour, which is this Saturday at 1 o'clock. And in fact, a couple of the friends are here that typically, have been involved in the past. Anything you want to say about the Greenwood Cemetery tours?
Come to the tour.
Linda Buchanan.
This is the Pioneer Tour. Right.
Surprisingly interesting.
So these are our first settlers, right?
Yes, right. Other questions or comments?
Well, I have a comment. I'm most impressed. I wish today's politicians would learn from such role models of statesmen who really served their, city and their country. But today it's just get reelected. That's all they care.
What I'm very impressed by is how, especially WD, did it in the face of a lot of opposition. In fact, Marion Clisby, in her oral history, talked about, or maybe somebody else, maybe Martha told me, that one of the family stories is that as she would hear about it, about what her dad had done, and she would hear it all over town. And he said to her, "Don't worry about it. They're not mad at you. They're mad at me. I can handle it." And you can imagine this is a small town. Everybody knows everybody.
I have one good politician story, I think.
Oh, good. A good politician story.
During that time, I can't remember April's first name, because I think you remember.
George.
George April, who owned the eccentric, was one of the people who was furious at W. Clisby.
Yeah, he was willing to take that risk. I mean, for his purposes, it made sense to do it, and I don't know. I mean, it wasn't being politically correct, I guess, but it definitely got some things done. And actually, yeah, looking back, of course, we see all the benefits of his forward thinking. But at the time, nobody wants someone to do, you don't want a politician to spend public money behind your back, I mean, that is just terrible. Yes?
And of course, all those efforts, when new people come to town and say, well, why doesn't Big Woodward go through Birmingham?
And you know why now. You can tell them. In your elevator, 5 minutes in an elevator, you can tell them what you know about it. Yes?
Did you say the city bought the Allen house?
Yes, technically the property was purchased,
Okay.
and that's what the public funds were raised for, as well as the, removal of the house, the Hunter house.
Does that property go down to the river?
It does. It goes down to the river on the west side. It's very steep, but the Clisby period, the Randall period, there was a stone wall built in there. Actually, Horace Randall was interesting too, because when he lived in the schoolhouse, he also apparently kept a herd of deer. Have you heard that, Linda or Pam? He kept a herd of deer, and he fed them, in a little enclosure right along the Rouge River there. And they're still there. They still come up and eat. They eat our flowers. Yeah.
On Willits every day.
Exactly, on Willits, right. So, so it goes down and a little bit across the Rouge River onto the other side a little bit, and then all along Willits in the back, and then it comes up. There's a house right next to this, which is actually Martha Baldwin's old house, and the lot line comes right up next to that.
Leslie, can I just?
Yes.
One point, only for family pride. The part of the woods west of the lawn of the
Yeah,
house was from my parents, belonged to my father. So that part was a gift.
Okay.
And the house was sold for $75,000.
Okay, so the house was sold for $75,000, and I'm repeating this for the record. And the portion to the west of the house, down to the
one
river?
that's the hill that you showed the
Yeah.
trail up, just because my parents would like to pick up that in the record.
Yeah. So that was donated by Jim Allen and his wife. And your mom's name was? Rosemary. And there's a story, I don't know if I can get it right, so you help me if I have the words wrong, but that when she met him, something about after the first few seconds, she never realized after that again that he had polio, because she was so impressed by his personality. Something like that?
First thing she noticed about him and the first thing she forgot, I think.
Oh, that's perfect. Thank you. The first thing she noticed about him was his polio, and it was the first thing she forgot. Other questions or comments? Yes.
What corner of Chester and Maple was the Hill School on?
Let me see if I can go back and it'll show up.
Parking lot is.
Where the big
Parking structure is?
Yeah, where the parking structure is.
Not church.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, where the Baldwin house, yeah, that's right, where the Baldwin house is.
Where Baldwin House is?
Yeah, I'm going back because I think one of these maps will show it.
That's south of the.
Well, then it's not on the corner of Maple.
No, so it's
Corner of Mars.
Martin. Yes, I misspoke.
Where Baldwin.
I'm sorry, I confused that.
Where Baldwin House is.
I know
Where Baldwin House is.
the library.
Yeah. Yes. Yep. I mean, it's such a small place. They're all really close together.
And why is Willits spelled W-I-L-L? Isn't it W-I-L-L-I-T-S?
It's been spelled a couple of different ways over time, but
Today
it's with an I, right. I can only say that the people supplying information to the Sanborn people misspelled it.
yeah.